Hello guys, welcome back to our Mpesa series. In this part 2 of database persistence, we're going to have a look at how we're going to achieve these to-do items that I've just listed, or basically the ones that I'm currently highlighting. So let's get into it. So number one thing that we're going to do is to create a model, or basically a document model that is going to represent our B2C and C2B entries in one table, and also our STK push entries in one table. Feel free to proceed as you may see fit, but in my case I'm just going to separate these two entries. So number one, let us have a look at the proposed structure as far as B2C C2B entries is concerned. So I have come and basically created a sample structure of how we are going to create ours in this episode. So we're going to have an internal ID, which is basically going to internally identify a transaction. We're going to have a transaction type, which could be a B2C or C2B. We're going to have a transaction ID as received from Mpesa. This is just going to be the phone number, the amount involved, the conversation, and the originator conversation ID. Now, these two will come in handy, especially during callbacks. Remember, when we do a B2C or C2B transaction, the only things that we do get is we get a conversation ID and an originator conversation ID. So when the callbacks will be coming into our callback endpoint, we must have a way in which we should be able to identify the transactions that we're being told about its status. So we can either use a conversation ID or an originator conversation ID. So that's why we need to put either conversation ID or an originator conversation ID. So the entry date, so in this case when in our system this transaction happened, the result code, was it successful or was it a failure, and also the raw callback payload response. So basically this is going to be the callback as received. So it could be something like this, right? So let's get into it. So number one thing that you need to do is, as we've seen here, is we create the documents or the data model for B2C entries. All right, so I'm just going to come here. I'm going to create a new package. I'm going to name it models, but in our case, since we are using MongoDB, we can even call them documents. Okay. Then we create a new class, in our case called B2C C2B entries. All right, so that being said, then let's continue to create the representation, or basically now the structure for this one. So the first thing that you need to do, so as to mark this as a MongoDB document, we have to annotate this with at document attribute. Then in this case we also need maybe to name our collection. So our collection, we could call it B2C C2B entries. All right. Okay, that's the first one. So we said we also need number one, an internal ID. This could be also in our case the ID or primary ID in our case. So private, we can just give this as a string, then internal ID, so Java name convention, so you can do that. So this is going to, I'm going to annotate this with at ID. All right, cool. Let me let me actually take the whole of this structure, put it here for easy readability. Alright, so yes, I think I will do this. Okay, so we have our internal ID. We also need to add what? Private string, the transaction type. Okay, transaction type. We also need the transaction ID. We also need, after transaction ID, we need the phone number, basically, which is the MSISDN. Right, so we also need we could use along for the amount. We could use private string. We need a conversation ID. We also need originator conversation ID. Originator conversation ID. We also need the entry date. Okay, so this could be a date time, right? Yeah, this just could be a date. Right, then we also need the result code, private this should be string, the result code. We also need the row callback payload response. All right, so we definitely need the getters and setters for this. So as usual, I'm going to annotate this with at data. So for the transaction ID, this is definitely going to be a unique field. So there is no transaction which is going to have the same similar transaction ID. So we can just come here and do at indexed, right? At index, then we say unique true, right? So with that, we should be having at least the first let me just do this. Actually, even the conversation ID and also the originator conversation ID should also be unique, because for each and every request that we are going to be sending is going to be a separate request. So we do not expect that the similar transaction is going to be quote unquote re-requested. All right, the only thing we can do is maybe fetch its status. All right, good. So at least now with this one we should be good. So the other document that we need to create is for the STK push entries. So let's proceed. Let us create the STK push entries. So my proposed structure for STK push entries is something like this. Okay, something like this. Right, so as usual, we needed to annotate this with at document. Then the collection, we could name it STK push entries. Right, okay, then we definitely need to have a private string internal ID. We definitely need to have a private string, the transaction type. We definitely need the string, the phone number, of course the amount. We also need the merchant request ID. So this is one of the differences in which we get for our STK push request, as opposed to, let's say, a conversation ID and an originator conversation ID as is seen for B2C or C2B transaction. For STK push, we have a merchant request ID and a checkout request ID. All right. So let's put those attributes there. We also need to put a checkout request ID. All right. We also need a date. Okay, date. In this case, should be the entry date. We also need the result code. Okay, the result code, and finally the payload response. So let's just take what we have from here. Okay, as usual, this is going to be at ID. We need basically the primary key, the transaction type, the phone number, the amount, merchant. This is definitely going to be indexed, so should be unique, true, right? Okay, same applies for the checkout request ID, the entry date. Okay, cool. And as usual, you definitely need the getters and setters. All right, so we now have the document representation for our STK push entries. Okay, now so this one is done. So the next item that we need to do is to create a repository for the two data models or the two documents that we have just created. All right, so this one is no longer to do, this one is now done. So this is where we are. All right, so we create the repositories. For that, I'm going to create another package. I'm going to call it repository. Okay, so the first repository that I'm going to create is for the STK push entries repository. So let's come here, let us create a class repository. Okay, so this one I'm going to remove like that. So STK push entries repository. Now this is going to be an interface. All right, so if you're familiar with the Mongo repository or the Spring repository pattern, so this should be straightforward for you. So we need to extend, in our case now, Mongo repository. All right, so which is going to be our object is going to be STK push entries. Okay, we need to import that STK push entries, and the primary key is going to be of type string. So basically that's what just this thing does. Okay, and just by that we've already created a repository for the STK push entries. The same applies for the B2C entries repository. So let us proceed. Come here, let us create a new interface called like this repository. So let us remove these dashes. So B2C C2B entries repositories. All right, so as usual we extend Mongo repository. So in our case, which is going to be the document in this case, we got that one right. So let us import. The primary key is going to be also of type string. All right, now the beauty of just doing this is that out of the box, just by extending this Mongo repository, we already have default implementation of the save method. We can also have find one, find by ID, find all, count, delete by ID, etc, etc. So here comes one of the powers of this, in this case the Mongo repository. There is a typo here, so let us repo like that, repository. Cool. All right, so I think so far we are so good. Okay, this is a repository. Yeah, here we go. So we add this one is now no longer into to do. Okay, this one is now done. So we now need to create now these other tasks, or basically to complete these other tasks. So actually let us have a look at this. Create method to update a record. Now I'm going to show you what I was trying to say, that we already have different default implementations of various methods just by extending the Mongo repository. So let me just do this void test repo. Okay, so I'm just going to come and outwire one of the repository final. Let's say it could be an STK push entries repository. You can name it like that. Then let us outwire the constructor. So if I now take these, this is what I meant. See, we already have a save all. We can even do an insert, a delete by ID. We could even say find all, find by ID, find one. You see, so this is what I meant by just by extending that particular repository, we already have, should I say, a magic implementation of the core methods that we need to be implementing. Okay, so let's proceed. So we need to delete this because we already have an update method. Okay, so the other thing is we need to create a method to find by conversation or originator conversation ID. This is for a B2C or C2B. All right, so here we go. Now to do that, okay, let me just copy this. Let us come to our B2C C2B entries repository. So this is what we need to implement. So for this, the only thing that we need to do is something like this: B2C C2B entries. Since each we expect only one record to have a particular conversation or originator conversation ID. So I'm going to come say find by, all right, so which is the field that we want to use. This is a conversation ID. All right, so you can come and say find by conversation ID or what, or conversation ID or originator conversation ID or originator conversation ID. All right, so string conversation ID or string originator conversation ID. And just like that, we've implemented this method of where we should be able to find a record by conversation or originator conversation ID. So now the other implementation is to create a method where we should be able to find a record by merchant or merchant request ID or the checkout request ID. So this applies for the STK push. All right, so we also expect a single entry, so like that. So I'm going to say find by merchant request ID or checkout request ID, just like that. Then string where is our by merchant request ID, so it looks like this: merchant request ID, and also by checkout request ID. All right, so far so good, we've done that. So up to here we are okay, right? The final one is a method where we can find a record by transaction ID. All right, this is going to cut across both STK push and B2C. So let us come first of all for STK. All right, so this is going to be find transaction by transaction ID, right? So we expect, okay, then find by transaction okay, how did you name it? Find by transaction type. Actually, that's a good one. We did not add the transaction ID for this document representation, so you can come and say private string, then supposed to be transaction. Actually, let me just grab this one here and use it. So find by transaction ID. So we can come back to the repository, then we can say find by transaction ID. There you go. So string transaction ID. Okay, and just like that we are done. So we do the same thing for B2C, C2B entries repositories, right? So here we are. So we expect like that. So find by transaction ID, string transaction ID, and that's just it. So we have done quite a number of things in here. So we've created a method to find by merchant request or checkout request, and also by transaction ID. Same thing we did for B2C, C2B entries repositories. So with that, we have been able now to achieve all these to do items, and without any kind of having any particular issues or complexities. And I think with that, this brings us to an end for this part 2 of our episode. So the final episode, now we are going to see how we should now be able to persist all these transactions now into our Mongo database. So be sure to subscribe and to turn on the notifications bell. I will see you on the next one. Have a good one.